Welcome, everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome to our last
Number 8.
Number 9.
Number 9.
Number
We've
9.
been talking for 8 hours already.
Going on 9 weeks now. So we're excited to have everybody here. Looks like this is working. Hopefully you all can hear us. We're excited today. We've got a very long list of questions to get through. So thank you to everybody who sent in questions both over the last week, but for the whole series. Some of these are going straight back to our very first tasting about Bordeaux blends, so we're excited to jump back into it.
And the reason we didn't get to some of these is because some of them are fairly long answer questions also. So some are quick and some are less so.
Yes. So we do still want you to be able to send questions in. So just a reminder, we've got the chat function and the Q&A box. So if you can, be sure to put any questions in the Q&A box. That'll just make it a little easier for Angela to grab them more quickly and share them with us. She'll, of course, be monitoring the chat as well. So if they end up there, that's okay too. But try and put them in the Q&A. And of course, if you want your messages to go to everybody, please change your chat to panelists and attendees. And so what we thought we would do today is we've kind of tried to group questions together as much as we can, put them in some kind of order here. So I wanted to let you know what the order was in the outline, and that way, if you have any related questions, you can drop them in, and before we change gears, we'll check with Angela and make sure that we don't have any lingering questions related to that particular topic. So,
although I'm not sure we're going to get through all the ones we have. So.
Yeah, well, we'll do our best, but you know where we are. So if we don't get to anything, you can track us down. We'll do our best to answer them. So we're going to start with some questions related to farming. In particular, there was a lot of questions related to grafting and replanting, pruning and climate. We'll then move on to some questions about winemaking. Most of them are related to blends, so we can dive into that a little bit more. Then there are some questions about the ranch and the winery, some of the history. People have asked who these folks are. We can go into that. And then we'll sort of wrap up with any questions related to aging and tasting wine, if you have any of those. And then sort of a true grab bag at the end, sort of random questions that don't really fit neatly into any of those categories. But first, the wines. So we picked these wines. Here we are at the last one. We picked them primarily because they are some of our favorites. That's really the only logic here. As everybody knows, Mike is partial to Zin in many ways.
Right.
And I would say that the Hendry Albariño is probably the one that I drink the most of, I would say. So that's something I really love. So we thought we'd share a little bit about what we like about them and a little bit about the wines and food, of course, before we jump in. So,
and for me with Zinfandel, I think I've used this line already, but if all we did was buy wine on the basis of blind tastings, I think there would be a lot more Zinfandel. It's something that, it has a very broad appeal. It's easy to drink. You don't have to sort of argue with yourself about why you like it. It's goes with a wide range of foods. It has enough, density and flavor to be really appealing, but it's not so concentrated or so light that you have to be very particular with the foods you use it with. So it's a great all-around wine. And obviously the history and the story and our experience with it is part of the appeal for me, but Zin's an easy go-to that's going to please a lot of people.
Yeah, I love it. I'm a California born and bred native, so we ate a lot of tri-tip growing up in our house, and we drank a lot of Zinfandel too. So to me, that's always sort of a classic pairing that I really like. But I agree, I think it's super flexible, and it's something that even, if you're a vegetarian, you're not probably having a lot of tri-tip, but I think, hearty bean stews, or, it is something that can, I think, span a lot of different cuisines and sort of food topics. So yeah. The Albariño is probably less flexible, but I've said this before too. I really love a good amount of acidity in wine, so that's why I gravitate towards the Albariño. It kind of wakes up your palate. You get that sort of mouth-watering sensation, which personally I love. If you don't love acid as much, you might not like it quite in the same way, but I think it's delicious. And this week, today is finally kind of cooled down, but we had some really hot days this week, mid-90s, and
actually I think we broke 100.
Did we?
And some locally some all-time temperature records on Tuesday. And now we're back to highs in the 70s and chance of rain tomorrow. So we're having some pretty big swings.
So yeah, go figure. But I don't particularly want to eat any really heavy food when it's mid 90s topping out at 100. So the Albariño and something like I love fish tacos with that. That can be nice and light. So
although we are mindful of those of you who go through more 100-degree heat than we do, there was a lot of complaining locally for 2 hot days. So we apologize for being dramatic about that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's move on. So let's start with farming. And cheers. We're
cheers.
We're gonna relax and drink more this time, or I am at least. So we had a lot of questions about grafting. So we thought we would show a couple quick pictures first.
I feel like the grafting video that it didn't really work. So now I have a series of pictures that we'll go through pretty quickly, and then we'll talk about these grafting related issues.
Yeah, and we do have all of the videos, including all of these, on the website, including that grafting video. So you can always go back and check it out if you like. So people had asked sort of what actually happens when you're grafting. What does it look like?
So these are the basics. This is the trunk of a rootstock, and the cut in that trunk is starting to be made here. So there are 2 basic cuts. This is the first, which is a little steeper cut inward. And then the second higher, more shallow cut is made, and what it does is create a shape in the trunk. We can kind of keep moving along here. Like this. So there's the piece that you've taken out. Now the goal is you cut a bud out of a branch from the kind of vine you want in a way that matches that shape. So we can keep moving here, and you can see how that fits. If you've done it properly, you things line up pretty well. Obviously, the closer in diameter the branch you're using and the trunk of the rootstock you are, the easier this is. But the key to making this graft work is to lining up that layer between the bark. Really, that it's the cambium cells, which are the ones that are busy differentiating into different tissue types, and they're making new cells. So if you align the cambium cells in the bud with the cambium cells in the trunk, and the plant is actively growing, then those callus and heal together. If you're grafting to a bigger trunk, obviously it's much more difficult to make those edges line up. So we often move the bud over to one side. You can't put the bud in the middle, you move it over to one side so you're overlapping with the cambium layer. And then what you do is you press it in there and you bind it up with a rubber band, like that. And then we cover it up with dirt to keep it humid in there. And then the graft takes will come along in the next year and cut the top off the vine. And then the shoot that is produced by that bud becomes the new vine. So there it is, very quickly. So that's what happens. That's what you're doing when you're grafting. The question, one of these questions was, can you use any part of a branch? And the answer is no, you need that bud. If you were to take a section of a branch and graft it in there without that meristematic bud tissue, you wouldn't form a new shoot. It would heal on there, but you wouldn't get a new shoot. And inside that bud, if you cut it in half, there's already a shoot that's formed and sort of ready to go. It's sort of a jack-in-the-box kind of plant that's ready to grow up the vine.
The analogy I heard was like a toy lightsaber.
Oh.
It's all telescoped in there, and then it starts to come out. So
okay.
It's very effective analogy. And that saves us a little. So when we graft, and someone had asked about this Albariño in particular, said, do you guys have more of that? Did you achieve it by grafting something else over? And we did. And when you graft, it does save you a little time as opposed to just starting completely fresh.
Right.
Vineyard, right.
So the time it takes to establish a new vineyard, more than anything, is about the development of the root system. And most of our plantings within the last 30 years are 7-foot rows and 5 feet between the vines. So you've got 35 square feet per vine. And that takes about 7 years to get that root system expanded to the point that it's using all of that space. If you graft to a developed vine already with a mature root system, we can really have the plant back to full production in about 3 years. Yeah. So it's less than half of the time. The trick is you you need to make sure you're grafting to healthy plants, and sometimes that's possible and sometimes not.
Yeah. One of the most common rootstocks we use here is something called St. George, and Allison Carter, who is a relation, I will say, my sister, had asked if anyone ever makes wine out of those grapes.
Yeah, so what St. George is a cultivar or a selection from a native North American species of plant called Vitis vinifera. And there are a number of different grapevine species, and really generally they're naturally what's called dioecious. And a dioecious plant has separate male and female plants. So the St. George that we grow just has pollen. So I've never seen a St. George grape, and I've never seen a female St. George vine. I feel a bit like the Ents in Lord of the Rings when I say that, but I've never seen them. So they just produce pollen and not grapes.
Yeah, although it was interesting when I was looking into this, so, Mike had that answer sort of ready to go, but I just Googled St. George wine, and there is a grape that is Vitis vinifera, so very different than the rootstock we're using here.
Different species.
Being grown mostly over in Greece, and it has some Greek name that I'm not going to attempt to butcher, but it sometimes goes by St. George. So if you Google it, you might find actually some St. George wine, but it's very different than what we're...
Google Vitis rupestris if you want that.
Yeah.
Rupestris.
And so someone else had asked about pollination in general, and so Vitis vinifera is a little bit different to some extent, right?
So Jody Hacker asked this question, and if you're really interested in flowering and grapevines, there are whole books on the subject, but it's actually the flowering and fruiting process is really interesting, and it's really a 2-year process. So right now, as these buds are developing and right around bloom time is sort of critical for the formation of the flowers for next year. So toward the end of this year, if you cut buds in half on those branches, you can actually see flower forms that are ready to go in this toy lightsaber version of a shoot. So that's the start of the process. And then when you get bloom and pollination, there are a bunch of things that affect it. So these plants, because they're hermaphroditic, are mostly self-pollinating. So they don't really rely on bees. You do occasionally see insects on them, and on the end of the stamen is a little drop of liquid which pollen grains sort of stick to. And when the pollen grains stick to it, they first swell up, and then they form a tube that actually then goes down and fertilizes the egg. And the growth of this pollen tube is very weather dependent. In cold weather, below 60 degrees, it doesn't really move very much. It can take, at cooler temperatures, it can take as much as a week to develop. At temperatures between 80 and 90 degrees, this pollen tube can form in a matter of hours. So, rain during pollination, temperature during pollination, what happened the year before in terms of weather, creating flower primordia. These are all things that affect what you get in terms of flowers and fruit set. And how well the flowers pollinate, depends. It affects the size of the berry. Ultimately, there's other very interesting things happening during bloom as this grapevine's growing. And this is the time of the year where they're growing very quickly. Right. The growing tips on the plant are sinks for the sugars being produced in the leaves. So they're requiring sugars to be drawn up to make more tissue. And so much of that can happen that the flowers don't set very well. And this was actually, I talked about Mailbag and problems in getting it to set. This had a lot this was part of the reason Mailbag wouldn't set. And in fact, flowers are so dependent on the leaves close to them, they're not getting sugars coming back down the shoot from leaves further up. If you remove the basal leaves, the flowers won't really set at all.
The ones at the bottom.
Right, the ones at the bottom. So, there are a lot of interesting things about how grapevines bloom and how that pollination takes place. There are a bunch of, it's a big topic, and people have talked a lot about it. There's a really good chapter in this book, which is one of the, I've showed you this before, one of the classic old viticulture texts too. Yeah.
So replanting, Jeff Sasaki asks, is there a big difference in prices of different rootstocks and clones?
So, and no is the short answer for me. We talked a little about rootstocks and the number of different rootstocks that are available and why you might choose them. They're, salt tolerant ones, they're drought tolerant ones, there are ones that are more vigorous or less vigorous. And there are some, so, I mean, we pay $2.45 for a root, and no matter what kind of root, that's this year's price, no matter what kind we're buying, and that's a limited number, we pay the same thing. There are some rootstock choices that are kind of the recent products of incredibly expensive and time-consuming research, and a lot of that has to do with developing plants that are naturally disease resistant to some of these sort of devastating diseases that Vitis vinifera suffers from. And the idea is you take a resistant vine, usually a different species, and then you kind of cross things back. Well, that's different with varieties and rootstocks, but I'm kind of mixing the two here. But there are rootstocks that are resistant to certain viral pests and nematodes, and there may be royalties on some of those that make them more expensive. I don't know.
We're not picking those though.
But in terms of what we're buying, the answer is no.
Yeah.
So that was a long-winded way of saying no.
No.
Yeah.
What's the average life of a vine? So we've talked in the past about some of the diseases that come through that cause us, or various viruses that cause us to rip things out. But what's the average life of a vine, and what's considered old?
I feel like we're going super fast. Should we stop and have a sip of wine? Okay, this feels like the high speed.
We can. I've had a couple sips
let's
of
do
wine.
that. I want to take a breath and have a sip of Zinfandel.
Well, and Zinfandel, I think, is the one you see a lot that people, are labeling old vines Zinfandel, and that's become quite popular.
Right, and I think it's popular for a good reason. And I think these old vineyards deserve respect. And I think there's a very unusual set of circumstances that has to take place for these vineyards to ever get old. But I have seen things labeled old vine that are 30 years old. And I think people's reaction to that is usually, that's ridiculous. But I don't think it is. And for the reason that even within Napa, and I'm kind of guessing at these numbers, but I would guess that 90% of the vines here are less than 30 years old. So we don't think, most of us don't think of as a 30-year-old vineyard as a very old one. But there aren't a lot of vineyards that are over 30 years old. So we have a bunch now that are over 40, which again is not what you think of as super old vine, but it's still pretty rare.
Yeah.
And that, they're vines that have had to go through some of the wild swings in the business and the disease pressures that we've talked about, and still kind of made it, and they're still producing. And in terms of the periodicity of big changes in the wine industry, 30 years is a long time.
Right. Yeah. See the Cabernet episode from a couple weeks ago. And there is something called the Heritage Vineyard Society that, focuses on these older vineyards across the state. And their definition is that in order to be considered for membership or classification, I should say, as a heritage vineyard, heritage, not historical. Yeah. Is that the vineyard, the original plant date has to be 50 years old, or 50 years from back from now, which even that doesn't seem to us particularly old, but
yeah, and that also indicates that you're gonna, if you're creating a society like that, you don't want a ton of vineyards in there, and picking 50 years old is means like there's aren't a lot of vineyards that are included in that, even at 50 years. So when you have vineyards that are 100 years old, that highlights how rare that is. And but it's certainly possible. And you can, as we've sort of said in an earlier episode, if you really want to keep a vineyard going forever, you sort of can, but there are times when you just can't also.
So Kelly asks a related question. She points out that you hear these old vines with 100, 150 plus years of age. Does production go down over time? So
yes and no. I mean, vines often, you'll hear that from a million people. I think one of the reasons production declines is because disease is increasing. So you have, and it gets confusing because one of the arguments people make for why old vineyards are better is that they're lower yielding, and because they're lower yielding, it's more concentrated flavors. But if you look carefully, one of the things that's reducing that yield are things that would reduce fruit quality in other ways with, viral and bacterial diseases and fungal diseases. And so, it's more complicated. The only old vineyard that I spend a lot of time working on is the Moore Vineyard, and that's 115 years old this year. And every year it sets more fruit than I want it to have. So there's, even with a vineyard of that age, we're having to do a lot of thinning. So, but it's a complicated question and no short answer.
Yeah. So kind of related, we talked about replanting, grafting, then we get into sort of the growing season, pruning and tying.
Right.
We have had some questions about that. Some people had asked what we do with the removed canes that we prune. When we showed a video, people had noticed that there were some green ties wrapped around the branches onto the trellis wires and had wondered what those were for. And what do we do with everything we discard?
We call them grapevines for a reason. When you drive by and you look at them in a vineyard, they sort of look like a tree, but in their natural state, they climb up other things. And what they've done in terms of sort of a evolutionary sense is that they've kind of traded structure and strength to support themselves for a lot of vasculature. And really, so within grapevines have some of the highest flow rates for sap up and down of any plant. And they have, if you cut a grapevine in half and look at it, there are these very large and sort of obvious vascular passages through them, veins. And so we need to, when we're training them, unless they have something to support them, they'll fall over. So you have to tie them onto something. And because they're growing and expanding, you have to have something that stretches. So you can, and this, I'd like to find a better way to do this, but that green tie tape is designed to stretch with the plants as they get older. But, it's miles and miles of green plastic tape out there that does sort of eventually break down. But I wish we had another kind of stretchy, better way to support these plants until they can, either get a hold of the trellis or are big enough to support themselves, like some of those old head train vines are. But they need to be tied onto something or they'll just flop over.
Yeah, and you'll know this too if you ever have a sort of a vine. Lots of vines do this, right? Like in your yard, I had one that was climbing up a window screen. It was attaching to the little holes in the screen. So it needs something to hold on to.
Yeah.
What do we do with the removed canes when we prune?
They become compost. We chop them up and till them in, and within about a year, they've just disappeared completely.
Yeah.
It's part of the organic matter that we add back to the vineyard.
Then we have a question here from your sibling. Your brother asked, has anyone done experiments with blind tastings to see what sort of pruning strategy yields the best wine?
So this, and the problem with this question, so there are a lot of pruning studies and a lot of very interesting ones. The problem with the way this is phrased, and you probably knew this when you phrased it, is the notion of best wine. So usually what these studies are doing is varying a pruning method and looking for a difference or looking for a preference. And most viticulture studies now have some sensory component to them. They'll make a change in the vineyard. They'll measure changes in crop level. They'll do some chromatography on chemical differences in what's left. And then there's usually a tasting panel that evaluates differences. And sometimes the question is, can you tell a difference? The question is, do you like it better? Or the question is, what does it smell like? And there are a lot of, this is the American Journal of Enology and Viticulture. They cover all kinds of interesting things, including, the sensory impact of cheese on wine, and viticulture and winemaking. And, very quickly, this is the impact of pruning methods on yield components and juice and wine composition of Cynthiana grapes. I don't know what Cynthiana grapes are. They're some sort of hybrid, but a bunch of these pruning studies are also concerned with, pruning and canopy management is very time consuming and expensive. So some of these questions are, can we go through and prune these vines with a hedging machine and then mechanically pick them and is there a difference? And so, some of the basic pruning questions of, can we mechanically prune versus traditionally hand prune, and compare the wines and find a difference? And that's mostly what that study is looking at. But there are studies about, canopy management, for methoxypyrazines and Cabernet. Can we remove leaves and reduce that? And there are sensory aspects to that. There are, lots of studies along those lines.
Yeah.
But the best wine is the phrase that's not really possible to pursue.
Yeah. So we did an episode about a month ago on climate. We had some unanswered questions there. A couple here from Bruce LaBelle, one of our longtime club members. He was wondering, what are the sort of attributes of our wines that we could attribute to our, unique location here in Napa? We're kind of at the intersection of a couple of different AVAs. And he also asked, are there any effects of climate change that we're seeing in the ripening times, or in particular, with particular varieties? Yeah,
and some of the reasons we haven't answered Bruce's questions to this point is that they're pretty long answer questions. And I'm going to sort of lump these two together. I do, there's this notion of AVA, and Napa's got how many, 6 or 7 or 8 or 16, a lot. I guess I haven't counted recently, but what you want this AVA to represent is something unique, and something unique, in terms of flavor and how the grapes perform. And really, I think the way it's used more today is something unique geographically. Like it's this mountain, it's this area. And so I don't, pinpointing very specific wine flavors from specific AVAs is difficult. I do think one of we talked about climate here and how that topic is a little more complicated, but I feel like, certainly at our end of the valley, there's on average more marine influence, and what's happening, you asked about changes sort of climate wise. I think I've also said this, or I can't remember what I've said and what I haven't at this point, but what's happened to our harvests is that they've shifted to earlier, and that has more than anything to do with earlier bud break and earlier springs. It actually turns out, between bud break and bloom, if temperatures are very sort of cool, below a certain temperature point, the growing season really gets delayed. Above a certain temperature point, when it gets warm enough, interestingly, if you look at the data, that the ripening, let's say between bloom and harvest, when it's always going to be over 60 degrees here, highs kind of thing, you don't change the ripening length much with hotter or cooler weather. It stays fairly consistent. But this earlier growing season, there are changes that are important about that, depending on the timing of harvest relative to the hottest days of the year. So that's not unimportant, but it does look like, warmer temperatures in January and February and March are leading to earlier bud breaks, which is leading to earlier harvests. And right now I would much rather be in this end of the valley than the other end of the valley. I think things probably will continue to get warmer, and being closer to the marine influence, I think in the long run is not going to be a bad thing for us.
Yeah. And there was something I'd looked up, Bruce, in response to your question, on sort of we've talked a lot about sort of the different regions around the world that are making wine and sort of where they're concentrated. And I think you're seeing some changes, especially like on the peripheries of them. And so Champagne is a region that, turned to sparkling wine because, it's fairly chilly, and they were historically had sort of struggled with getting things ripe, and they typically rely, and you had mentioned this in your question, and you'd asked about sparkling wine, they're typically relying on Pinot Noir, Meunier, and Chardonnay. And over the last, since I think 2002, the number of hectares planted to Chardonnay, according to the sort of governing body in Champagne, has increased, and they're seeing that they're using more Chardonnay in the blends because it's adding a little more acidity compared to the other varieties. And as things are, they're seeing more consistent, warmer vintages there, that they say that that's helping in their blends. So we have to take their word at it, as the governing body. We obviously aren't making wine in Champagne ourselves, but so that, I think that it's an interesting question, certainly, and every region's going to have a slightly different response to it.
Yeah. And we talked about climate in another episode, and there's a big Chilean winery that I've been told, this is secondhand, so maybe it's not accurate at all, but somebody invested in a whole bunch of land in sort of the cool parts of Patagonia, assuming that this was going to be prime vineyard soon. And I don't know if that's true or not. I think there's no doubt that, you know, things are changing, but we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. So this question from Lauren Almond we thought was really interesting. How many labor hours go into a bottle of wine? Does it vary by varietal? Cool question.
So, and yeah, this is a good question. And I've never really sort of thought of it this way, but I very quickly kind of did the numbers with this math. So if we assume 2.5 tons per acre for our vineyard, which is a reasonable average.
2.5 tons of fruit that we,
right.
That's our yield. Yeah.
Yeah. And then using 60 cases per ton or 720 bottles, that comes out to roughly 200,000 bottles of wine from the vineyard. We have 10 full-time vineyard guys, and if they work, 40-hour weeks for 50 weeks, that's 20,000 hours. So if you divide 20,000 by 200,000, you have every bottle requires 1/10 of an hour of vineyard labor, or 6 minutes, or and it works out to almost a bottle per vine. But that's about $2.50 in vineyard labor per bottle. Then if you add a couple of guys in the cellar for the wine we make, that adds another almost $1. And then if you're talking to Angela or Megan or Therese or Tamara on the phone, then by that time we add another $1.50 in labor on that end. So we're up to almost $5 a bottle in people.
Yeah. But I do think your sort of second question, Lauren, about variety, like grape variety, is sort of interesting. And there are, I don't know if we can say that there's consistently one variety every year, but there could be things that happen. We've talked about some of the work that goes into, thinning, leaf thinning or suckering, and there could be years where we might have to do a second pass through particular vineyard blocks, in which case you're adding a little more work to that wine in that year. But would you say there's anything consistently that would be?
Well, I mean, some of our, if you're talking about averages with something like Zinfandel, where crop level wise, we're targeting 3.5 to 4 tons per acre. There are other things where we're targeting 2 tons per acre. So with Zinfandel, we have to do extra work and extra passes on the fruit thinning, but the crop level is a little higher. Other things, we can get by with 1 or 2 passes through the growing season. Everything needs to be pruned, but in terms of the leaf and shoot growth stuff, some requires multiple passes, some requires only 1. So, I think the answer is yes, it does. It does. Some varieties require more work than others here, the way we do it. Yeah. But I didn't calculate all those numbers.
Yeah, it was a provocative question, that's for sure. All right, and so then our last question related to farming. So if you have any others, throw them in the Q&A and we'll wrap up with those. But Steve Getz wants to know, what are your thoughts on biodynamic farming?
So we're not biodynamic, and I've I think I've mentioned that. There are, and I don't even understand all of biodynamics. There are a bunch of different forms of it.
Yeah, we should say that biodynamic, it's sort of a philosophy, I would almost argue. Some people think it's like organic on steroids, but well, I guess if you're organic, you're probably not using steroids. But it's not necessarily just sort of a more extreme version of organic. There are certain philosophies around timing of certain operations based on, phases of the moon and like the lunar calendar. And there,
to me, there are some people are burying goat horns full of manure on certain phases of the moon. And and some of this stuff makes no sense to me, and that's fine. And when it comes to things like biodynamics, I feel like biodynamics gives people a schedule and kind of a plan to follow, which I think is helpful. There are aspects of biodynamics and some kinds of biodynamics. Whoops, that was me. Some aspects of biodynamics that they make no sense to me, and they never will. But I can also say that there are plenty of smart and talented people making really good wine biodynamically, we just will never be included in that category.
Yeah, I took a trip to another winery here in Napa as part of a class, and they farm biodynamically and talked to their viticulturalist. And, you know, I was really impressed by her. I thought she was incredibly pragmatic. And she said, you know, there are principles that we love about this and we take, but, you know, if the calendar says we should pick on this day and it's pouring rain, we're not going to pick on that day, you know, even if we should be picking on that day otherwise. So,
yeah. So yeah, and biodynamics includes, you know, fruit days and cellar days, and you're supposed to work certain days in the cellar and certain days in, you know, where you taste wine, and so
yeah,
and I'm reasonably confident that this is not backed up by careful scientific study.
Yeah. But there are, you know, it's a philosophy, so and it works for some folks. But do you have any other farming related questions, Angela, or should we move on? All right, a lot of the winemaking questions that we had related to the blend, and that was the very first. We tasted the red. Well, we tasted it last week, but we really kind of talked about blends in particular the first week. So Leslie Serta had asked, when is our blend, the red, blended? And she was wondering how the flavor of a freshly blended wine tastes relative to that wine once it's had some time to sort of get integrated. And we blend oh, go ahead.
Well, I think integrated is one of the key phrases. I feel like, I mean, oak is a good example of this to me. Well, maybe chicken soup is a good example of this to me. And many of us can relate to making that maybe more than making wine. But when it cooks together and it spends time together and maybe sits in the fridge for a day or two, a lot of these flavors sort of blend together in sort of one taste. And I feel like often when you're making a blend or you know, combining things, you say that oak may stand out originally, but sort of blend in. And I feel like even in blending, you can sort of find your way to the different components when you're making the blending that you can't several months later. And I think other important things, there are ingredients and components to a blend that, you know, maybe even on their own. So there are certain barrel types. Again, for example, I'm using barrels again, but there are some barrels that, you know, if you just had a barrel full of this wine, you might not like that wine on its own that much, but once it's in a blend, it may become an important element that's ultimately quite subtle and nice. So you don't always, maybe we're back to chicken soup, but like you don't like pepper very much on its own, but when you put a little in the soup, it does something positive. So I've never used chicken soup before, but there you go.
Angel and I were talking about blending earlier, and we were talking about salad dressing. So I think there are a lot of, you know, pick your analogy. So Bruce, and I think this is very much related, had said, you know, in the blending process, if you find that you have a few attributes that you like and maybe one attribute that you don't, and you kind of want to improve upon that attribute, plus maybe add a little extra something else, how do you sort of decide on further blending actions? So what might the sequence of blending steps be? Well,
it can be that there are things, and we talked about the blend, and we talked about Petit Verdot and Malbec together. And the way I've always sort of thought of this is that, you know, the Petit Verdot, you know, I like wines with big tannin, and I like that tannin structure. But if you're looking at the Petit Verdot by itself, you know, I'm not trying to say that I don't like the tannin, but you're saying if we want to sell this wine in 2 years, we'd like to soften this tannin a little bit. And you know, Malbec is part of that. Malbec is, you know, it's even higher in total phenols than things like the Cabernet Sauvignon, but it's not particularly tannic. So it's sort of holding its own in terms of color and weight with the Petit Verdot, but it's softening the total tannins. There are, you know, wines that might be, you can start to be creative with, you know, think about it any way you want. You can start maybe Pinot Noir. You know, we're going to talk about this in a second, but nobody really blends with Pinot, but you could, I'm sure it'd be interesting. You could start to soften those tannins that way, but it would, given the difference in total phenolics, it would shift the wine in a completely different direction too.
Yeah. And when I talked, I was asking George this question this morning for you, Bruce, and you know, he pointed out that it really also comes down to what your end goal is with the wine. So you know, his goal with that red blend is to make something that's less tannic than the Cabernet, than our 100% Cabernet. So Cab's in the blend, so he's thinking like, what else am I going to add that's going to sort of soften that a little bit. So, and of course for him, the final goal is also, how's he going to pair this wine with, a particular meal or a particular dish. So, he made that addition as well. So is there ever a case, Mary Jo Casey wants to know, is there ever a case to use different vintages in a blend?
Yes, and a lot of wines are made. So from a labeling standpoint, if it says, at least with our regulations, I don't know how it varies in different countries, but what's on the label, it has to be 95% that vintage for you to label it with that vintage. But things like ports are traditionally blends of multiple years of wine. Many champagnes are, many sparkling wines are multiple vintage cuvées. And, in our case, we don't really do a lot of that. There are times when, so you with topping wine, so we have these barrels that sit in the cellar, and they're often, they're almost, depends on temperature and humidity, but they're, you're losing water out of them and you're topping them back up with wine. Occasionally, for reasons of convenience, if I don't want to break down a whole nother barrel and, have all these little containers, I may, for a month or two in between bottling, use a little bit of a different vintage. But that's a very small percentage, and it's, doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, I would say the stuff you see the most would be like fortified wines or champagne, in which case, like, you'll see on a lot of champagnes NB, meaning sort of non-vintage.
Yeah, but also, I can imagine cases where, let's say you had a ton of frost damage in the spring and you had a very, low crop level year, and the year before you'd had a very high crop level year. I'm sure there are cases and times where, just to try to, if you think you can take 5% of this one and boost the production of that vintage a little bit, maybe that makes sense. We've never had that situation, but I can imagine times and places and wineries where that would make sense.
Yeah. Somewhere somebody's trying it, right? Which sort of brings us to the next question, which is about Pinot Noir and blends. Someone noticed that we don't find a lot of Pinot Noir in blends. Is there a reason?
And that this is not a very satisfying reason to me. Again, if you went back to blind tastings and buying wine in blind tastings, we might do this a little more. I might, two things I might say. Pinot Noir is generally pretty delicate, and it's hard to take something delicate and make it a component of a blend with things that are less delicate, maybe, unless you're trying to really soften it in the case that I mentioned. But I think the worst answer I can give you is that people would view it as weird and
it's tradition.
Yeah, and it's true, but it's not necessarily a good answer. But if you you don't want to make blends that are, even if they're tasty, people look at them and go like, that's an odd thing to do.
Yeah.
And if we were a little more stubborn, we might do more of that, but it would be kind of an odd place to start. But I bet a Pinot and a Zin blend would be nice, but
yeah,
people would go, why'd you do that?
Right.
So
switching gears a little bit into some other winemaking. On one of our episodes, we had talked about removing alcohol. We talked about sort of reducing sugars, removing alcohol, changing the acidity, and all of that. And Kathy Proper asked, how do you remove alcohol? There are a couple of ways you could do it.
I rely on my liver for that, but actually, reverse osmosis is a way of doing it. So you can drive. If you have a membrane in the middle, normally things want to move from a concentration of higher concentration to lower concentration across the membrane. But if you increase the pressure on the lower concentration side, you can sort of force things across it against that gradient. Distillation is another, there are versions of distillation that can remove alcohol and then recombine the stuff that you want. We've done that a couple of times over the years, but it's fairly infrequent. It's not something you want to do a lot of, I don't think. There may be people who do it regularly, but there are a variety of filtration methods that are used for volatile acidity, for vinegar. People, this comes up in winemaking a bunch.
Yeah. So let's see, is this, it's not our last winemaking question. All right, well, we got to get to it. Are we finding more spiders?
No.
Okay. So Bruce wanted.
Ticks, actually.
Oh, good. Heard it's bad tick year.
I'll be back.
All right. So while we wait for Mike to come back about that, Pat Bubniak had sent us two really interesting questions about some trends that she's seeing in the industry. One was thoughts on lower alcohol wines. Asking sort of, is it a trend? You good?
Sorry, that's what happens when you walk around the vineyard at this time of year.
So we're just shifting gears to talk a little bit about lower alcohol wines. Pat Bubniak's question, is this a trend? Is this something, do we have any plans? Do we?
I think there's definitely been, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk about alcohol. It's a complicated subject. I think, again, if we went to blind tastings, it would maybe get even more complicated because it's not, I mean, I think there are wines that can certainly be in balance at higher alcohol levels and some at lower. I think that, there's a lot that's made of the difference in alcohol between, say, 14% and 15%. And the truth of that matter is that's the difference of one glass in 15, right? And I think if it's the concern is about alcohol, the best thing to do is drink less wine, not necessarily to pick ones that are higher or lower in alcohol. And so, if you have 2 glasses of wine, the difference between 14 and 15% is about an ounce of wine in 2 6-ounce glasses. So it's not, I think from a alcohol consumption point of view, it's not a huge issue. I think from the point of view of wine taste and style, it's a complicated one. I think many people agree that lower crop levels lead to, beneficial things in many parts of wine style, but lower crop levels are also associated with higher sugar levels at earlier periods in ripening, which lead to higher sugar. So or higher alcohol, so it's complicated. Yeah. And I think that some styles of wine, especially ones that depend on phenolic ripeness in a longer ripening period, they'll tend toward higher alcohol, especially if you are trying to do it at low crop levels. Other styles of wine where you don't need phenolic ripeness and you maybe want higher level of acidity. I mean, these are
2 good examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is 13.7. Our next, actually the next vintage we talked about Pinot Gris, and it's 12.7. So we have a range, and it's for a bunch of different reasons.
Right. Yeah. And I think what you're really talking about is balance, right?
Yeah.
And I remember once asking George, we've got 2 Chardonnays and there's a slightly higher alcohol content in the barrel fermented. And he said, well, it's about balance. You've got sort of this different component that you're adding, when you've put it into the barrel. And so he felt like, and this kind of comes down to your experience when you're tasting it, how it's going to feel balanced would change depending on a lot of other inputs, as you said, sort of the phenolic ripeness and everything like that. So to me, that's the most important thing. If a wine feels out of whack in some ways, either because of super high alcohol or maybe super low or something, then that's when it feels like not a great wine. But that can happen at a lot of different alcohol levels. Yeah. Pat also asked about labeling, which is sort of related to alcohol content. That's something we have to put on there. We have to state that, the wine contains sulfites, but other than that, right now, there isn't a whole lot of ingredient listing that has to happen on wine labels. And she was wondering, there's been a little controversy. Some people think that wine should be forced to put an ingredient label on there. Others argue no. Do we have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ingredients are very boring. I mean, it's basically grapes, and there's a point where we add yeast, although they're no longer there. So I don't know if you list that as an ingredient. And sometimes it's water, and it might be a little tartaric acid, but there's not much in there. So I feel like the ingredients would be fairly uninteresting. I think there are, I think for the style of wine that we make and most people here, that's all that's in there. So, listing that is, we could certainly do. I think, sort of caloric content and that sort of thing are interesting, but it's, maybe it should be like that because it's so many other foods are, right. But I think there's not much to the topic.
Yeah, I would say when I've read articles that argue one way or the other, the people who are arguing for it, say we want to know if there are these various additives in the wine, and I completely understand that.
What additives are they?
Mega purple and things like that, or if there are particular fining agents that have been used. I would argue, if you...
Although mega purple is also just a grape extract.
Right.
Extract.
Yeah. So
anyway, you'd still be grapes, right?
Yeah. But I think if you really want to know, to me, the best thing, and it sort of goes with your own food as well, is if you really have some questions, I think it's best to buy from producers. I mean, I'm biased here, but producers like Hendry, or smaller independent folks where you can actually have a chance to ask these questions in a setting like this or something like that, as opposed to just something you find at the store where you don't know where it's made and all of that. So to me, it kind of goes back to small farming.
I mean, maybe the best answer for doing it is that people seem to think there's a mystery there, and maybe that's the best reason for just putting it on there. But it's there's not. Yeah. And I don't know. In some foods, you can read a bunch of things, and at the bottom it'll say natural and artificial flavors. And even though we list things like sulfites on the label, I mean they're there probably at the point you're drinking it in 1 or 2 parts per million. And I think if you went by the standards of other foods, you wouldn't even be required to list that. So right. It's a very simple, I mean, it's a very simple product that's been more or less like this for thousands of years. And there's not much in there.
Right. Yeah. All right. Any other questions about winemaking? All right. Seems like we got a lot of these in advance, which is great. So couple of quick ones about the ranch and the winery history. What was the winery's first vintage?
1992. That is a short answer question.
Yes.
You got that one.
The next one, also a short answer question. Pat also says, your tasting notes are the best around. Who usually writes them? And that would be the one and only Tamara Landry.
Which reminds me, and Tamara, I think is watching, but I need to send you an Excel spreadsheet with vineyard data for your upcoming notes. And I keep forgetting.
Now we've got like 55 people here who are going to help keep you accountable.
Right.
So
okay.
You heard it here, everyone. No, but I completely agree with you, Pat. I think Tamara does a really great job of taking that kind of data and, tasting through and writing really lovely notes about the wine. So we're lucky that she does that. Bruce asked, back when George transitioned from grape growing to making wine, how did he decide on the technology and equipment to build and acquire as he increased winemaking capacity?
So George spent a lot of time running around the Opus One winery with a tape measure when he was planning on building this winery. And I think we were heavily influenced by the stuff that they had and they were using. That some of that worked and some of it didn't. We have a large basket press that's cast in the floor that was like the one they used, and we haven't used it for at least 15 years. But really the vineyard, the winery was designed around the vineyard in terms of the number of tanks that we needed and the kind of space and the size of the presses that we have are based on the lot sizes that we have. The tanks are designed to deal with the lot sizes of fruit we have, and they go from about 20 tons down to 1 or 2. So there was in the early days our relationship with Mondavi and Opus One had a lot to do with Bob Mueller was another guy. He came from Opus as well, but he had some input on the early winery design and technology.
It was well researched, in other words, which will surprise no one who knows George. So we have one question about sort of tasting wine, I guess, or around a particular wine. And this comes from Ken Fluger. Ken says, "We love your Albariño." Me too. Thank you. It seems as if this grape is rarely grown in the U.S. Is there a reason for this?
Well, it's new here. It's expanded. So we planted 2.5 acres in 2003, and that was 10% of the Albariño in California. Now there are 350 acres, or getting close to 400 or something. So it's expanding, but it's something that people have recently become aware of. I don't know. what grape is going to be, this is the multi-million-dollar question, right? Is what grape are people going to be interested in next? And there's no doubt that there are a bunch of interesting and flavorful grapes out there that are just not part of people's consciousness. And again, if we bought more wine on the basis of blind tastings, we'd have all sorts of grapes you've never heard of growing, but that seems to be not the way we do it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, here, I think in Napa, well, a lot of places in particular, there are lots of people who moved here, and, there used to be a lot more Riesling, for instance, in Napa. Sure. And you don't see a lot of Riesling these days, but there were a lot of Germans who settled here and, brought that with them. And Riesling
is another one of the famous grapes with a great track record.
Right. Yeah. So, it's trends change, but maybe we can sort of spearhead this Albariño.
Well, I think we have spearheaded it, but it's going to be interesting to see where it goes. There was another question I think we missed here. We started with that 2.5 acres, and then we grafted two different blocks to Albariño. Who was this question from? I don't remember, but somebody asked about more Albariño blocks, and we grafted 2 of our Pinot Gris blocks over to Albariño. So we're down to 1 acre Pinot Gris, but about 7 acres of Albariño.
Yeah, that was Chris Halpin from a couple weeks ago. All right, so we are now into sort of truly the grab bag moment here. We've got a couple questions. One is about this moment of time, this pandemic, the coronavirus. A number of folks asked us how the pandemic is affecting operations here. Specifically, are we worried about getting enough workers for the season and for harvest?
So that hasn't affected our labor, and it's easy to, in a vineyard like this, it's easy to work and maintain physical distancing from other people. So everybody's kept working, and none of our staff has turned over in that sense. Yeah. So in terms of vineyard labor, I don't think there is a big issue right now. So we'll see. Yeah. And our approach to labor, I've also mentioned, is a more long-term one. It's not a short-term
thing. Which is definitely becoming more unique to, I think, Hendry. In terms of other operations, I think, agriculture has been, we've been allowed to continue our work, and a lot of the work, as you said, can be done with safety protocols. So from an operations perspective, in terms of making the wine, not a lot has really changed. Of course, the biggest change has been in formats like this, in terms of being able or not being able to welcome guests to the tasting room. But we're grateful that there's technology like this that allows us to connect anyway. So
people sitting down inside are much more affected than people, working outside.
Yeah. The rest of the questions have to do with dogs. So somebody Dave and Joanne Harris wanted to know, what breed is Gilby?
Gilby is a cross between, we're not 100% sure. He's growing like a weed. So we're going to show you, this is what he looked like 4 weeks ago. That was the first day he came home with Drew, and this is what he looks like now. So you can see how fast he's growing. His mom was a Great Pyrenees, and his dad, we're not sure, but the guess was McNabb, which is a northern. It's not recognized by any official breeders, but it's sort of a Northern California ranching dog that sort of looks like a border collie, but a little more shepherdish.
What are you calling it?
I'm now calling Gilby Mayacamas Shepherd.
Yeah. So again, heard it here first.
Yeah.
And some other folks had asked what happened to the rescue dog. And I actually think that we've got a couple here. So you may have met Honey, Angela's dog, who was a rescue dog, who's still here and thriving, right, Ange?
Yes.
Grouchy, but thriving. And Jeff and Jan's dog, Gracie, is still here and trotting after.
She was a rescue from the fires, the Lake County fires, several years ago. And our dog, Jake, who was, he passed away in October. So Gilby is the replacement for Jake.
And we also have I guess Gilby is now technically the newest addition to the bunch, but a couple months ago, Therese got a new dog, Scooter, who's adorable. So also a rescue. So
you need to be more specific with your rescue dog question.
Rescue dog. But I think that covers about all the dogs here at Hendry. So hopefully, there will definitely be some combination of all those dogs rolling around on the lawn and chasing after people here when we can open up the tasting room again. So we hope that you'll come back and see them. Any other questions, Ange?
No.
Wow, we did it. We did it
Yeah.
with, oh, it's precisely
So
4 o'clock.
we want to say thank you for staying with us through this, and
Yeah.
we do, you know, it's meant a lot to us to have this sort of help and input and concern and, you know, business from you guys through all this. So
I would
thank
say
you.
that is not to be totally cheesy, but it's true that that's, I think, the biggest impact of this whole experience is we knew we were really lucky in our club members and our supporters before, but this whole experience really reinforced that. You know, aside from these tastings, Angela's been you know, running nonstop, it seems, for the past 8 weeks, answering phone calls and emails. And so we've really, truly been touched by that. So we're really grateful. And while we are taking a brief hiatus from this format, we will keep the virtual tastings going in some capacity. We just need some time to sort of.
We've now been talking for 9 hours, so we've run out of things that we know for a while.
Mike's not going to, we've got to learn a couple more things. And if you have ideas, please send them our way. You know, we're thinking maybe, you know, of doing these group things. It's been really fun to connect with people on the chat, I know. So we'll think of some way to get everybody back together again. We're very aware that many of you are, you know, not here, not because of the coronavirus, but because you just unfortunately live much farther away from us than we would like. So we'll figure out something. In the meantime, we are doing private virtual tastings. So if you have a group of friends or something that you think would really love to get together virtually and try Hendry wine, you know, one of us would be happy to do a tasting for you guys via Zoom. We've done a couple so far and they've been really fun. So that's always an option. And of course, just send us your thoughts and we'll be here drinking wine and look forward to seeing you all again when we can see you again safely in person. So thank you very much.
Cheers, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.